Hi, everyone. Just wanted to quickly jump on here before the episode to say that this episode is about Chacham Nieto, the author of Mateh Dan, Kuzari HaSheini, and other works. And his yard site is Chav Ches Teves. So this episode is being released on Chav Tes Teves. So yesterday on Shabbos was his yard site. So the episode was recorded a while ago, but once I realized when his yard site was, I figured it's appropriate to release it around that time. I know I don't specifically or usually release episodes around yard site, but it's just not something. Just it's not. There's no reason specifically. I don't want to just how it is. I know Rabbi Dr. David Katz in his podcast a lot of times does post episodes for the God of the week, so to speak, about whose yard site it is. But here I don't. But I once figured in this case it made sense. And he was nifter in 1728. Also, if anyone's interested in sponsoring an episode, supporting the podcast in any way, I want to thank everyone who has sponsored episodes or anyone who supported in any way, any amount of money. There's a link in the show's notes. You can do that or check out the website, seforimchatter.com, or email me for other forms of payment or support if you want. As well as I appreciate everyone who has, especially on Apple Podcast, if you can rate the podcast and review the podcast. Many listeners have. I really appreciate that. If you haven't as well, it's a help to the podcast. And I guess also on Spotify, but Apple Podcasts mainly, if you can. And if anyone has any questions or comments or guest suggestions or topic suggestions, please email me, seforimchatter@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Matt Goldish, who is the Samuel M. and Esther Melton Chair in History at The Ohio State University. And we will be discussing this time Chacham Nieto, who was famously the rabbi in London in the early 18th century, and who wrote a number of works. I guess most famous probably Mateh Dan, also known as Kuzari HaSheini, as well as Eshdas against Nechemia Chayun, and then some other works in Spanish as well. So thank you, Professor Goldish, once again for joining me.
Happy to be here.
So let's start off. Let's talk about Chacham Nieto. When was he born? Where was he born? What was the early biography, what is early part of his life?
So he was born in 1654 in Venice. He was descended from Spanish Jews who are generally described as conversos. I'm not quite sure how people know that was a converso family, but that's the way he's described. His family moved to Livorno, and he lived there, and he was a chacham or a rav in Livorno for a number of years. He, meanwhile, had also gone to medical school in Padova near Venice, which was the one medical school in that region that allowed Jews to study there. And so he was a physician with a university training, and we may have more to say about the exact nature of that training later. And in 1701, he was invited to become the Chacham of the Sephardim of London, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews congregation in London. They had just built a beautiful new esnoga, a new synagogue there, and he was the Rav there and lived there until his death in 1728.
Okay, so a couple of things also about his early life. So he, like you said, he was in Venice. I believe there's a tshuva, right? His father is referenced in Dvar Shmuel Avua, right?
Right. So his father was Rav Pinchas Nieto, or Reb Pinchas Nieto, who is apparently also a Talmid Chacham, and was in touch and is mentioned in the Shalos HaTshuvos of Rav Abuhav. He's a major figure. Yeah.
So, okay. So then now he went to Padua, which, like you said, allowed Jews, also was a pretty prestigious medical university.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Very prestigious. In fact, that's the university where Galileo studied and taught 50 years earlier or so. So, yeah, probably by the time Nieto was there, probably closer to 70 years earlier. So that was a very prestigious university. However, it was a university that still taught mostly Aristotelian and maybe some Neoplatonic thinking. Medicine changed very slowly during this time. The real major changes in medicine weren't really until the 19th century. So he was still trained in Galenic medicine, Hippocratic medicine, Aristotelian logic, Aristotelian worldviews. That was the training that he had there. And it shows up when he writes.
Right, for sure, as we'll get to. So then he goes around Italy and he gets to, so we should mention, I think we glossed over, he was in Livorno for a while. And Livorno is where, I don't know if he was a Dayan, a Rav, and he also, I believe, wrote his first work in Livorno, right? A work on calendars, which we can revisit later. I just want, that's all right, correct?
Correct, right. While he was in Livorno, Livorno is an interesting community also. Livorno is a community that was made up, a large percentage of the population there was former conversos and their descendants also. So he was there, and while he was there, he wrote a book about how the dates of Easter, according to the Orthodox Church as well as the Catholic Church, and the dates of Pesach fall out, how they relate to each other, and how the respective calendars of these different groups operate. So he was a big expert on the calendar. And he did not publish that work until he arrived in London. And for some reason, he also published it with a false place of publication. People usually did that when they were afraid that something they wrote was going to be taken as heresy. For example, if you were in England in the late Middle Ages, right after the invention of print, sort of in the beginning of the Renaissance, you wanted to print a certain kind of Bible. You wouldn't tell anybody that you had printed it in England so that they wouldn't come looking for your press. You'd tell them it was printed on the continent somewhere, that kind of thing.
And this work was written in Italian.
Italian. Yeah.
So yeah, people today, I think it's the Italian is still confined, but it's not. It never was translated into anything else, as far as I know.
No, I don't know how much interest there is in this kind of work. In other words, the other books that we'll probably be talking more about, there are people who are still particularly interested in them. I would guess that anybody who is interested in the subject of Easter and Pesach and the dates and the complicated calendrics probably could make their way through the Italian. It's also in dialogue form. All his major works are in dialogue form. And it is interesting that he wrote it in Italian because he did know how to write in Latin as well as in Hebrew and Spanish. And the learned world still operated in Latin at the time. It was, once again, Galileo who kind of broke the mold and wrote in Italian when he wrote his major works on science in the early 17th century, because he wanted to make sure that those works were available to ordinary people. So it may be that Chacham Nieto had the same idea, writing in Italian, because we all read Italian, of course.
Okay, so let's get to London. So he ends up in London. So we probably should take a step back before we get really into Chacham Nieto's life and outlook and his theology. But in London, the community was relatively new, right? Menashe ben Israel, I guess, went to Oliver Cromwell a number of years earlier, and that's when the Jews were allowed back in. And that, again, was a Sephardic community, or former converso community, like a satellite community of Amsterdam. And I know that the chief rabbi before him is someone that you've written and researched extensively. We've discussed on our Chacham Tzvi series, Shlomo Ayalon, who went to Amsterdam. So talk a little bit about the community and the structure of the community and its outlook and how big it was, etc.
Okay, so just about the time that Chacham Nieto, before he was Chacham Nieto, David Nieto, just about the time he was busy being born is the time that Chacham Menashe ben Israel of Amsterdam, went to London at the invitation of some millenarians, some Christians who were expecting their person to be coming back. And Menashe was perhaps, along with lots of other Jews, was expecting the Jewish Messiah. And they invited him. The background is a whole different story, which maybe someday when you've covered every other topic, you could have me on to talk about that. But Menashe ben Israel went to London. Jews had been thrown out of England in the year 1290 and were not allowed back. But this was the middle of the Civil War period in England, and lots of strange sects, sects to be sure what I'm talking about is clear, were popping up in England, levelers and Quakers and ranters and all these groups. Lots of very strange stuff was going on, and there was a sense that maybe it was a time that Jews might be readmitted. And there's a whole background to this, but Menashe ben Israel did not succeed. He died a few years later without accomplishing his mission. However, the Civil War was over, and King Charles II returned from exile in 1660. At this point, there were a bunch of conversos living as Catholics that had been the case in England since the late 16th century. So there's a whole kind of community of these people living outwardly as Catholics. It's not quite clear how secret the secret was, but the long and short of it is that the secret came out that these people were practicing Judaism, and the king allowed them to stay. There was a lot of controversy about that, but that was the reestablishment of a Jewish community, a known and public Jewish community in England after the Middle Ages. So it was a relatively new community. Many of the members had been living as Catholics for a long time in England or in other places, had a close relationship, as you mentioned, to the Amsterdam community, which it saw as the sort of mothership. And the Jews there in London really ran the gamut, from people who were deeply dedicated to a really normative Jewish community, all the way to people who were just sort of hangers-on. And I've written a little about this. There was a kind of a vague cloud of people who were somehow associated with the community, but not completely. Maybe some were members, maybe some weren't. Maybe they kept some of the mitzvot, maybe they didn't keep all of them. There was a point at which there was a member of the Ma'amad in London, the governing board of the community, who went to synagogue on Saturday morning and to church on Sunday morning. So maybe you get a sense of what kind of place this was. But there were other types of people also. There were very Orthodox figures there as well. So this is the community that developed. They had various figures who kind of led them. Chacham Yaakov Sasportas, who is a known figure for us, was the first official rabbi who served there in 1665. He fled from the plague and the fire in London right in that time, and went to Hamburg, which is where he was during the Shabtai Tzvi episode. So he was in London, I guess, 1664, 65. And then there was a period, Chacham Yoshua da Silva was the Chacham in London for about 10 years. And then starting from 1689, Chacham Shlomo Ayalon, as you mentioned, was the Chacham of London. He was a major Talmid Chacham, highly respected figure, came from Saloniki, and as you well know, he was also a secret Sabbatean believer. He had his detractors. It's not quite clear whether these were anti-Sabbateans or people who had other issues with him, the Fidanki family and so on. but he was there for 10 years. A lot of the biographers and the people who have written about the community claim that he left after 10 years, right around 100, because he was run out of town, because his Sabbatean proclivities had been discovered, something like that. There's no reason to think that any of that was the case. He was being offered the job of chief Chacham in Amsterdam, which is a much bigger, highly respected community, the greatest of the Western Sephardic communities. And so that was a kind of obvious move for him. And so in his absence, Chacham Nieto was invited to take over. So people have made a lot of the idea that Chacham Ayalon had left behind in London a bunch of Sabbatean believers. We know that there were Sabbateans there. There were writings of Cardoso, which were found in the London community and so on. But this idea that Nieto was attacked, or his detractors were these Sabbateans, there's really no evidence for that. But that's something people have claimed.
But something interesting is they went from Ayalon, who was a closet Sabbatean, right, to Chacham Nieto. He was like a staunch rationalist, kind of. He was a, medical doctor, some sort of PhD. And isn't that, why do you research it to go from, it's like opposite extremes almost?
Well, Ayalon wouldn't have been known to the community as a Sabbatean. He was known as a Kabbalist. He was a great Talmudist, probably significantly superior to Nieto, I would guess, in that area. Kind of classically trained from Saloniki, very well-known Talmid Chacham. So that would have been his profile in the community, presumably, whether or not anybody knew some of his secrets, and some of those secrets were pretty wild. But it definitely is. He probably would have been understood to be a Kabbalist, as well as a Talmudist and a Halachist. Yes, Nieto is a very different kind of person. Was the community looking specifically for somebody who was more of a rationalist, more interested in sciences and so on? It's a little hard to say, because the kind of people who lived in that community, not that many of them were really deeply interested in philosophical and scientific issues. Certain figures were. We may get to a person like Jacob de Castro Sarmento, who's a close student of Nieto, but most of the people there were mainly interested in business and in keeping their profile low and making a living. So were they specifically looking for a person like this? It's possible, but it's a little hard to know.
Okay, so then we'll come back to more about his life, because he was involved in two distinct controversies. One was involving him, and one was not involving him, so I think he got involved in. But how would you say we said he was medically trained, he was a physician. Interestingly, the London community said he was not allowed to practice medicine when they hired him, right? Which is interesting also. But what was his overall attitude, his outlook on Jewish life, science, etc.?
So he's very interesting in this way. Jacob Petukovsky, who wrote the one and only full-length monograph on Nieto in the 1950s. And there's an older, very important work by Israel Solomons, but the real monograph on him is by Petukovsky. And Petukovsky compares him here and there to Rav Hirsch in the 19th century. He says, he's strictly Orthodox. He's very dedicated to Orthodox Judaism, as we might call it, and yet people look at him askance a little bit because he deals with some topics that make people a little nervous, something like that. Well, Nieto was a fully traditional, fully dedicated a Jew, right? Really a rabbi, fully what we would think of as Orthodox, I suppose. But there are some interesting things about his thought which make it a little different than the typical rabbi of the time. So he is a medical doctor also. That had been a not uncommon situation in the 16th century. It was not all that common by the time that Chacham Nieto became the Chacham of London. So that was a little unusual. He was absolutely fascinated by science and philosophy. And David Ruderman wrote about this in an article and then in a chapter in his book about Jews in early modern science, that Nieto turns to science and science-related topics every time he gets the chance. He's writing a book about the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral Torah, and defending the oral Torah. The longest chapter in the book, the 4th chapter, all about science and philosophy. The 5th chapter, all about the mechanics of the calendar. He's writing a book about defending traditional Judaism from the Sabbatean heresy of Nechemia Chayun. And he gets done with Chayun pretty quickly, and he turns to science. He wants to talk more about science. Right? He always seems to be kind of fascinated by that subject, and he's turning to it at every opportunity. So that's kind of unusual. He does not appear to believe in the ancient origins of the Zohar. Now, he's a contemporary, an older contemporary of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who is famous for opinions about that. It's interesting the way that Chacham Nieto sort of reveals this opinion, because when he is writing about nature, he says the term nature, teva, is not an old term in Judaism. It's only a few hundred years old. And that's a term that's used in the Zohar. And he's well aware of this. And he makes some defense about it, explaining that, well, it's about when the Zohar was revealed as opposed to when it was written, but really, that has nothing to do with it. So he essentially reveals his view that he does not believe that the Zohar is from Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai from 1700 years earlier, that he thinks that it is a medieval product, the 13th century or early 14th century. So that's rather unusual at the time, of course. He also is just absolutely interested in the discoveries in the New World, discoveries in China, the latest kind of news and information about world religions. And he has some views that are, again, they are not by any means heretical in the Jewish world, but they are not, he's interested in a lot of topics that most other rabbis really aren't dealing with at that time. So he's got a lot of what I have called in an article, the spirit of the 18th century going on.
Right. I think you called it, isn't it, part of some sort of conservative enlightenment, where he's like,
correct,
like you're saying, he's conservative on the one hand, he's being the staunchly orthodox, so to speak, and then on the other hand, he's very enlightened, very interested in science. He's a physician, etc.
So one of the things that's important to understand about his context and about London at this time is that the period that we are talking about is the period of the early Enlightenment. And London is one of the epicenters of Enlightenment thought. He is right in the thick of it. He is living in the same city as Sir Isaac Newton, as John Locke, as all these figures who really help shape the modern world. But when Petukovsky deals with him, he speaks as if there are only two extremes. There's orthodoxy, whether that's in Christianity or Judaism, there's a sort of an orthodox position, and then there's deism. So deism is a position which indeed was being espoused by people in England at the time, a significant number of people, which was the position that God had indeed created the world, but God had created the world with a set of rules, the rules of nature, the rules by which the world runs, and kind of walked away from it. He lets it work by itself according to those rules. So we know what the Chazal say about that. We know that there are certain ideas in Judaism about that. And he was Nieto was very interested in this idea and what the problems with it were. But the thing is that there wasn't just orthodoxy and deism. There were all kinds of positions in between. And since Petukovsky wrote, these have been, right, in the past 60, 70 years, these positions have been developed and explored by scholarship. So we now speak about a radical enlightenment. That might be the deists and people even further to the extreme. But there's also a sort of a conservative enlightenment. There is, David Sorkin has written a fascinating book about what's called the religious enlightenment, the idea that you can be a rationalist and an enlightened European while still remaining deeply religious. That is an idea. So all these different sort of flavors of enlightenment have come out, and England has its own versions. The English church becomes absolutely fascinated by Newton and Newtonianism, and they develop an idea that's called physico-theology, which is it's a sort of a marriage of Newtonian physics and mechanics with the theology of the Church of England. So it's called latitudinarianism or physico-theology. That is a product of that kind of marriage of ideas. So they believe, unlike the deists, they believe deeply in providence, but they feel that the rules of nature, which are revealed by Newton in his book, The Principia, which was published in 1687, that regular operation of the law of nature revealed God in the universe operating according to rules which operate in both the world of the cosmos and the world of man, and that they reveal God operating in the universe, God the watchmaker, right? The famous idea that if you see something as detailed and as complex as the workings of nature that we see, that there can't be this complexity without a creator. It wouldn't just happen by itself, right? The idea of the divine watchmaker. If you find a watch, nobody would imagine that it just fell together out of pieces of rocks and so on. You know when you see the watch that there was a watchmaker. So in the same way, when you see our complex universe, especially the complex universe working according to these amazing universal rules discovered by Newton and his colleagues, then you know that there is a God in heaven who is provident over the world and so on. I should explain that this is kind of a new development of the 17th century that Johannes Kepler, who lived in the early part of the 17th century, in the 1710s and 20s, he was the first person in history to formulate an actual universal law of nature. He was the first person ever to discover in observing nature universal laws which are true always and everywhere. I won't go into the background of that, but that is a new idea in the 17th century. And Newton follows in the footsteps of Kepler in a lot of ways and formulates more laws, more universal laws of nature. And this creates a situation in which people, on the one hand, are fascinated by God's workings in the cosmos, but other people are heading toward this idea that although Newton explains how God is at work in all the laws of nature, which he formulates, he shows here is where God is at work, and here is why you need God here, and so on. Other people are sort of looking at what Newton has done and saying, well, it all kind of works without the God part too. And Newton hates this. And the latitudinarian members of the Church of England and ministers and so on, they hate this and so on. But there's a whole spectrum, different gradations of how people regard God's role in the world, from the people who think that God is involved, the divine providence is involved in every single thing that happens, and everything's about God's providence, all the way to people who think that God has nothing to do with it, people like the deists. This is the world into which our Chacham Nieto is entering, the world of John Locke, the world of Sir Isaac Newton, the world of Robert Boyle, although Boyle has passed away by this point. So there is an intellectual ferment going on in England, which is really in many ways right at the center of the action of the early Enlightenment at this point. So all these ideas are percolating around. Meanwhile, his own congregation is made up of people, many of whom have never seen a Jewish community in their lives. People who grew up as Catholics, they come to London, they have never seen a Jewish community. They are now going to live as Jews. They have no clue as to what that means. Right? This had been the situation in Amsterdam about a century earlier and for decades after that. Now, there are people in London who have lived as Jews. There are second and third generation former conversos there, but there are also people who are arriving there knowing nothing whatsoever. And some of those people are very kind of skeptical about the nature of Judaism as they found it in Western Europe. If they lived in Spain or Portugal, they might have the point of view that Uriel da Costa offers us. He says, I thought that being Jewish meant doing what the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament says. I read it in Spain or in Portugal. I read it and I thought, okay, that's what I want to do. That's what the Jews do. And I came to Western Europe, and they have a whole different world of laws and ideas and so on that come from this alleged oral tradition that they keep talking about, and Talmud and so on. I don't know anything about that. What I'm familiar with is the Bible, and they do not live according to the laws of the Bible. So there are people who have some version of that philosophy or that outlook in the London community as well, who grew up as conversos and don't really have an appreciation or a value for the oral tradition, the Torah Shebaal Peh, the Talmud, and the development of halacha as it is practiced in the Jewish world of their time. So that's another challenge that Chacham Nieto has to deal with. He's also dealing with people who grew up or who are familiar with Catholic Christianity, and Catholic Christianity with an Inquisition. They now come to London, which is a Protestant country. It has just undergone a second civil war, the Glorious Revolution, 1688-89. And it is really relatively liberal about religious positions that are allowed to exist in England. And there is a real fear that the kind of Christianity that's being practiced in England is going to be much more appealing to Jews than Catholicism. And they hate the Catholics there. And there are lots of people who are trying to talk to these Jews all the time about, well, look at this kind of Christianity that we have here. It doesn't have all these horrible ideas that the Catholics practice and all the idolatry of Catholicism and this kind of thing. So that's another challenge that he has to deal with. And I'll say that, Sabbateanism is an issue, right? So Chacham Ayalon has just left. There are certainly Sabbateans, right? Believers in Shabtaut and Sabbateanism in England, in London. And who knows what they think and who knows what they are going to make of their new Chacham. Finally, Chacham Nieto himself comes from Italy, and there are some interesting developments in Italy itself in the 17th century, and I will point specifically to a work called the Kol Sachal. The Kol Sachal is referred to by somebody in the 19th century as the Shulchan Aruch of the Apikoresim. It shows up in Venice in the early 17th century. It claims to be by a certain person that it's clearly not by that person. It was probably actually written by Rabbi Leon de Modena, who is a member of the Beit Din, actually, I think the Av Beit Din for a period in Venice. And my friend David Malkiel has done some extremely careful work on this, as have other people. The point is that within Italian Judaism itself, from which Chacham Nieto is coming, there have been some kind of heterodox developments over the 17th century, which may have crept into the community in London as well. So he has challenges from every side.
Okay, so obviously we're going to go a little bit more in depth on some of these, but I guess the first one we should start on is when you were talking for a while about the deism and providence and nature, because that was he got involved in a big controversy. This is kind of famous, I guess. The most famous thing about him, probably, for anyone that knows of him, so somewhat famous, is that he talked about it. I'll read. It's been translated to English now, available on Amazon. I'll link to it, but I can't vouch for the translator or the work, but it's for some reason somewhat translated now. On divine providence or universal nature or naturing nature. So this was I think a sermon he gave first. Basically how he said, nature is God, God is nature, and he got into big trouble with the congregants. So talk a little bit about how he waded into this and the subsequent story that happened.
Okay. So to understand this amazing and fascinating controversy, you need to go back to those thrilling days of yesteryear, to the 1650s and 60s, and the work of our landsman, our fellow Jew, Baruch de Espinosa, or Benedict Spinoza. Spinoza was a son of Portuguese conversos who had come to Amsterdam, and he became one of the most famous philosophers in history. And he famously was excommunicated by the Amsterdam Jewish community for his beliefs, and his beliefs became a kind of a flagship for early Enlightenment radical religious or anti-religious thought. Spinoza talks lots and lots and lots about God, but he gives himself away at one point when he says, Deus sive natura, that is, God, which is nature. So he is some form, I know that this is overly simplistic for the philosophers out there, but he's some form of a pantheist. He essentially thinks that God and nature are in some sense the same. And he makes some distinctions about things in nature. He talks about natura naturans, which is the active aspect of nature, and natura naturata, which is the passive aspects of nature. This is way complex and gets into the depths of Spinoza's thought, but those terms are important. So Spinoza sort of represents total heresy for both Christians and Jews. And he's kind of the poster child for heresy. Jews are not allowed to talk about him or read his work or anything, which of course does not mean that they didn't, but they're not supposed to. He's in Cherem, so on. Well, some people in the yeshiva in London, somewhere around 1703, seem to be talking about some ideas that they heard perhaps from some deists out on the street somewhere, or in a coffee house, maybe. Everything bad happens in coffee houses, of course. And they come in and they're talking about it. And the Chacham, David Nieto, says, all these things that they say about nature, nature is not really what you think. He says nature and God are really the same thing, because when people talk about nature did this happens in nature and so on, what they really mean is that God did this and God did that. We just use the term nature, but we're really, what we've always spoken about as Jews is that these are things that God did. And even the term nature, as we said before, even the term nature is a relatively new term, teva. And it's really all God. And people push him about this, so he ends up giving a sermon in the synagogue about the same idea, that nature and God are all the same thing. And what it means is that everything that people attribute to nature is really God. Now, I have no doubt in the world that his formulation of saying that God and nature are the same thing, he was trying to catch the attention of the pseudo-philosophers and the thinkers and so on in the congregation, the people who had heard a little bit about Spinoza, as I think Nieto himself did, and he wanted to sort of pull them in and get them involved in what he was going to say. And then he makes a very orthodox point that all these things that are attributed to nature, it really isn't something different. It's just what God is doing. People just call that nature. Well, shortly after this, a guy shows up to a wedding in London, and he sees a friend of his, a guy named Sarfati, who's sort of hanging out outside the wedding hall. And he says, why don't you go in? Who's inside? And he says, well, there are a bunch of people. And then there's Chacham Nieto. And the guy says to Sarfati, yeah, what's the problem with that? And he says, well, I don't want to go any place where there's a naturist, a naturist. He essentially accuses the Chacham of being a heretic because he said God and nature are the same thing. He accuses him of heresy for this. So the Muhammad, the lay leaders, pushed Sarfati to make his case. He makes his case, and Chacham Nieto, in response, writes this extensive book in which he explains exactly what he means, and he points out that nature is just a term that people use for the things that God does. He has a lot of quotations from Tanakh, from Chazal, from the Zohar, even basic things like Tehillim, where it says, right, God makes this happen and that happen in nature, the sun, and everything else, and so on. And Sarfati and apparently some friends of his are still not satisfied. They still think that their Chacham is a heretic. The question is turned over ultimately. They try to ask the Beit Din in Amsterdam to adjudicate the case. Don't forget that the Av Beit Din in Amsterdam at this time is Chacham Ayalon, the predecessor of Nieto in London. So that doesn't seem like such a good idea. And whatever, the Beit Din in Amsterdam doesn't deal with it, and they don't know quite what to do. So somebody in London suggests that they go to the Ashkenazi rabbi of Altona, whose name is the Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi. The Chacham Tzvi, still very famous today, had trained not only in Ashkenaz, but he had trained in Saloniki and in Kushta, that is to say in Salonika and in Constantinople or Istanbul, with Sephardic Chachamim. So he had a certain edge over other Ashkenazi rabbis in the eyes of these very proud Portuguese and Spanish Sephardim, that he had been trained also as a Sephardi rabbi as well as an Ashkenazi one. And so they turned the question over to the Chacham Tzvi. It's in his Shilos Tshuvos, I think, number Yudchet. And he sides completely with Chacham Nieto. And he says that these other people don't understand, and that Chacham Nieto is to be praised for the point that he's making, and so on. So the controversy sort of comes to an end, but we do have this fascinating book about the nature of God and about nature and God and divine providence, which is written by Chacham Nieto right at the outset of the 18th century, right around 1703-04. And it is amazing to have that document, because these questions, as I was saying before, the questions of nature and God and divine providence, and how God is involved in a world that operates according to these absolutely provable rules of nature, which have been formulated particularly by Newton. These are huge issues and discussions in England and all around Western Europe at this time. And here we have Chacham Nieto, who is clearly, from the way that he frames the question and frames his answer and the points that he brings up in the book, wants to show his congregation that, number one, he is a philosopher and he knows how to answer the tough questions. Number two, that he has the educational background to know how to answer. And number three, that Judaism has an answer to all the problems and all the questions that are being asked by deists, by Christians, by Spinozas, by every kind of heterodox person or non-believer. Judaism is ready with an answer. The problem is that his answers are pretty weak. His answers really rely on his training as an Aristotelian philosopher and a Neoplatonist, and they don't address the kinds of questions that are being asked about nature and about divine providence in England after the publication of Newton's Principia in 1687, right? This is 25 years later. And he doesn't really know. I mean, he's interested. He has this student, De Castro Sarmiento, who is really a Newtonian, who really knows. But Nieto himself, he's really still talking in the terms of the discussion as it had existed 50 years earlier. He's heard of Copernicus and Copernicanism. He's familiar a little, at least with the name of Descartes, of Gassendi. He knows a little bit about those things. I don't think he ever mentions Newton anywhere in his writings. So he's kind of out of date. Now, maybe that didn't make a whole bunch of difference to his congregants. Maybe what he had to say was quite convincing enough in this Spanish book that was clearly written for his congregants' consumption. But to us, looking back from the 21st century, it is clear that Nieto is a man of his time. He is not a man ahead of his time. He's probably very typical of a lot of thinkers in that period, but he's living in a world that's changing very, very quickly. He's living in the same city as Sir Isaac Newton, who's now the head of the English Mint. He's living in the middle of these rapidly developing philosophical and scientific trends. And he doesn't speak English or read English. He says that in a letter to somebody. He's relying on the ideas that he learned back in medical school. Yeah.
Now, like you said, it is Tshuva Yurches, Shaila Yurches, and the Chacham Tzvi. I just would read the title that he gives him, just for people to. We've been talking about Chacham Nieto as a little different, but the Shaila says, whoever wrote the Shaila, I don't know if the Chacham Tzvi rewrote the Shailas here, but it says Hachacham Hamaroimim Ve'anale Kimareinu Harav Rabbeinu David Nieto Nar. Not sure, Rahman, I guess Avbez and Umayr Tzedek, etc. Then it goes, but Tshuva. He says, Roya ani es divrei chacham hamaroimim v'nalo neiroi. And he goes through. So the Chacham Tzvi later on had a personal relationship with him, but clearly had a very high, opinion of Chacham Nieto. And it is, people can read. That's why I said it's famous, because people don't choose Chacham Tzvi. It is in Chacham Tzvi. So, and also it's interesting that they first went to the Mamad to listen to this, as if these Balavatim, as if these rich guys were going to have any clue of not Talmidei Chachamim, they weren't, philosophers, and they're going to decide over here. It's just always a little ridiculous and hilarious, actually. Like these guys were making the decisions. I guess that was always the structure of the Sephardic communities there, but it's a little funny to think about.
I think that it was this guy Tzarfati and his friends and the rest of the community came down on them pretty hard.
Right. So that, like I said, this has been recently translated in a paperback by I can't vouch for the translator of the work, but it's now in English. If someone does want to check it out, it wasn't, so it is in English. It's on Amazon. I can put a link to that as well. There's actually another work there that the same person translated, which is Triumphs of Poverty, something he spoke about poverty. I think it was about tzedakah he was talking about. So that's a smaller another sermon that he wrote into a book. Right. Yeah, not a famous work. The other. So there was two. That was the first controversy. There was his other, I guess, class. There's the two works he wrote in Hebrew. One involves another controversy, and one is not. But also, I guess we can go either way. Let's go first, I guess, with the more famous work, Mateh Dan, Kuzari HaSheini. Mateh Dan is for David Nieto. That was his work where the Kuzari famously, Rabbi Levi, was about defending Torah Shebechzav, and he went and he wrote now Kuzari HaSheini defending Torah Shabbal Peh. So he claims in the interest, it's now available Mosader of Cook. There's a short biography from Cecil Roth in there. It's the same. They put it out with a new cover now, but it's the same old print. They didn't change anything. Now although there is a picture of him. If anybody wants to see, he's got his English wig on, and he has this little goatee, and he really looks like a real Sephardic, English person. So he does write here that this is, we'll talk about the work, but also he writes that it was written against Karaites. There wasn't real Karaites in England. Was he really was it literal, or was he talking about, like you said, Spinoza, the Casta, those that, especially in his former Converso community, that had an issue believing in Torah Shabbal Peh?
Right. So this becomes a little complicated because the rejection of Torah Shabbal Peh, of the oral traditions, has a long, long history. that goes back at least as far as the Bayit Sheni period, the Boethusians, and the Tzadokites, the Tzedukim, who rejected the oral traditions even as they existed in their time. They are essentially destroyed with the temple in 70 of the Common Era, but I understand that some recent scholarship suggests that their ideas continued into the Middle Ages. You then get the appearance of the actual Karaites in the 8th century, Anan ben David, and they actively reject the oral traditions, but they do find it very difficult to practice Judaism strictly according to the Torah Shebichtav, according to the written Torah. If you're interested in how these difficulties might look, I recommend a book a guy wrote a few years ago called My Year of Living Biblically. I don't know if you've ever seen that. I've forgotten the author's name, but he decides he's going to try. This guy does various wild projects and writes books about them. So his project at this point was to try and live according to the laws of the Bible. He said his wife almost threw him out of the house at a certain point. Right. It was the book is very comical, but it gives you a sense of what the Karaites might have been dealing with in trying to practice biblical Judaism. So what ends up happening with the Karaites is that in a lot of ways they develop their own oral traditions and practices, and they change a lot over time and space as the Karaites spread out in different areas. But they are still quite active and definitely exist at the time of Chacham Nieto. They had been pretty active in the 16th and 17th centuries. And he starts out this book about his defense, the Kuzari HaSheini, the second Kuzari defending the Torah Shebaal Peh, talking about a guy named Eliyahu Baziachi, who is a Karaite scholar from maybe a couple of centuries before Nieto is writing. And he says he's responding to him, but other places he makes it pretty clear that he's really addressing all the different questions and problems that his own congregants, the former conversos, have about the oral Torah. It happens to be that my teacher, Yosef Kaplan, discovered that there was a group in Amsterdam who sort of seceded from the congregation maybe a generation before the Kuzari HaSheini, and talked about themselves as Karaites. They actively made themselves out as Karaites, even though they did not come from actual Karaite communities. So there's a sort of a meeting of the minds of people who reject the oral Torah, whether they are Karaites, whether they are people who identify with the Sadducees. I should mention that at this time, Henry Moore, who is an English clergyman, has written a book called Sadducismus Triumphatus, the triumph over the Sadducees. He sees various heretics of his own time in the Christian world as Sadducees. He describes them as Sadducees. So a lot of different strands of anti-oral Torah ideas exist. There's also a movement against Kabbalah that's around, and Kabbalah is sometimes taken as an element of the oral Torah. So this is the group of ideas against which Chacham Nieto is writing, and he gives lots of very interesting arguments about why there has to be an oral tradition. He actually starts out by talking about how there was an oral tradition even before the written Torah was given. And he gives examples of how the patriarchs and matriarchs must have had oral traditions about the things that God expected of them. And then he goes into a much more extensive set of proofs about the oral law that is necessary to understand the written law in all kinds of areas, not just the ones that we hear a lot about, like the identity of an esrog, but many more, right? And some of them very creative proofs of why there had to be an oral law. And then he moves on to talking about the wisdom of the Chachamim. So you should understand that this oral tradition isn't just some invention by some people, but that the Chachamim are these extremely wise figures. He gives an argument that actually goes back to the church fathers and was very popular in Renaissance Italy, explaining that the sciences and philosophies of the Gentiles all come from the Jews originally. That argument, again, was invented by Christians, but it was used by Jews all along. It's heavily used by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari, and the Kuzari HaSheini uses that argument also. So there's a lot about the wisdom of the Chachamim. And so this book is in 5 dialogues. The 4th dialogue is all essentially about the wisdom of the Chachamim and proving that they knew all the sciences and all the philosophy and the arts and so on. So that's another opportunity for him to talk about science. And then the 5th dialogue is really about the calendar and calendrics and the wisdom of the Chachamim in developing the calendar. So that is the book that he writes. And for many people, the 4th book is the most interesting book because we get a sense of not only his ideas about science and philosophy, but also about how he thinks Judaism relates to those areas and how he feels Jews should regard the ideas of not only the ancient sciences and scientists and philosophers, but also the more recent ones.
Right, and like he said, he really goes through a lot of Teresh Malpeh, and then he goes through with Teresh B'chsav. It's a really interesting, the first couple. I think so. It's also a dialogue, like you said. A lot of his books are dialogues. This was he published it, I think, in a Spanish translation, and then in a dual edition, and then there also was some sort of English edition published of some of it in the 19th century. Correct?
Yes.
Okay. Also, interestingly, the Mosad of Cook edition, there's a picture in the front cover from manuscript of the Chacham and the Kuzar king. I didn't know where it was from. Rabbi David Katz was a podcast as well, and he just actually did just recently an episode on Nieto. He said there that Nieto himself drew this picture. I didn't know that. He said that he was an artist and he drew this picture. I don't know, but it's printed in the Mosad of Cook. It's a very nice picture. It's in the Mosad of Cook edition. Like I said, the Mosad of Cook edition is available. It's an old font, and but it has a little biography from Cecil Roth in the back as well. His final work that we have to discuss, which relates to our previous 2 episodes together, is about Shabta'ut, about Sabbatianism. And that is H. Das, that was never redone. And that was how he kind of repaid the favor to the Chacham Tzvi and got involved in the Nechemia Chayun controversy, which I guess we should mention a little bit about Nechemia Chayun, and then what that work was, why he wrote it, and what he wrote there.
So Nechemia Chayun was probably a pretty major Talmid Chacham, a really major scholar, but he was also a very complicated, strange character. So he was a Sabbatean. He wrote. He took a book that had long been attributed to Shabtai Tzvi himself, put his own name on it, and by hook and by crook, or by fakery, he put Haskamot from important German rabbis on it and published it, I think, in Frankfurt, Oz Lelokim, and his Sabbatean philosophy ended up being essentially a Trinitarian philosophy. He separated the Ein Sof, the unknown, unknowable God, from the God of Israel. That is to say, the God that we know as the author of the Torah and so on, right, in Jewish tradition. And he ends up with three different parts of God. It looks very Christian, and indeed, later in his life, he converts to Christianity. So you can imagine that this is a highly heretical book, but as fairly complicated Kabbalah, most people might not recognize the Sabbatean nature, the heretical nature. It looks like complex Kabbalah. That's Oz Elokim, right? That's, I guess, the second book. I'm sorry. So he goes around Europe. He's put in cherem various places. He is pursued by Rabbi Moshe Hajiz, who is the great heresy hunter of the period, and Elisheva Karlebach's famous book about him and his controversies contains a long section about the Chayun controversy. Chayun shows up in Amsterdam. It's a big hullabaloo. It's a big mess. Essentially, at that point, Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi is the Ashkenazi chief rabbi in Amsterdam, which by this point has a large Ashkenazi community. And Chacham Shlomo Eilon is the Sephardi chief rabbi. Now, as we have established, Eilon was a secret Sabbatean believer. He would not go along with Hajiz. He would not put Chayun in cherem, and his community rallied around him, and they ended up getting the Chacham Tzvi Ashkenazi put in cherem and thrown out of his job. It's almost unbelievable, but essentially what you see here is that the community cared a lot more about their community coherence and their status than they did about some obscure kind of Kabbalistic heresy, which they couldn't even recognize or see. So the Chacham Tzvi ends up going to London, where he is welcomed by both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi communities, and possibly as a kind of support for the Chacham Tzvi, possibly, I don't know, out of genuine anti-heresy motives, not quite clear, but Chacham Nieto writes his book, Eish Dat, opposing Chayun. And in classic Nieto style, he opens up with a bunch of arguments about Chayun, and maybe I'll say something about that in a moment. And then he goes on to talk about science and philosophy. He manages to tie it together and make it look like a smooth transition, but it's kind of humorous. So one of the interesting things about the way that he argues against Chayun gives us a sense, again, about how Nieto is different than the typical rabbis of his time. He says, look at Chayun with his tripartite God, right, and his rejection of all these standard tenets of Judaism. He says the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews, the Chinese, the wild peoples of Africa. He has, like, as people did at this time, sort of a very low opinion of the native peoples of Africa and the Americas. So this is him, not me, but he talks about the savages of Africa and the savages who live in the Americas and so on. He says, you know what, though? they all believe in one God. They all believe in God. They all believe in divine involvement in the world, and they all believe in reward and punishment. These are the three principles of Rabbi Yosef Albo, you'll recognize, right? He says they have different ideas about what they are, but everybody believes in them, except this guy Chayun, who has these crazy beliefs which are not acceptable to anybody. So this is a type of argument that's called ex consensu gentium. That is to say, it is based on the agreement of the peoples of the world. And it is not a type of argument which normally you would see in Jewish scholarship. I will say that the original Kuzari uses that kind of argument, but not very typical. And it sort of shows you how fascinated Chacham Nieto is with the peoples of the world, the religions of the world, and this almost enlightenment idea that there is a shared monotheism and shared basic principles of religion, especially among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and even to a certain extent among other peoples of the world. So there you get a sense of the type of argument that he would make that really nobody else, certainly in the Chayun controversy, was making, that you can see how bad a heretic Chayun is because everybody else agrees to principles which he rejects.
Wow. So definitely a really fascinating figure. Like I said, only Mateh Dan is still around. Now those other works were translated, but recently they're kind of obscure. And like you said, the Eshtas never was reprinted. It's only published once. I mean, I'm sure it's available online, but it's never only was done once. Just to finish up on his life, so he ended up in London the rest of his life, and I believe his son became the rabbi after him. What was the end of his life?
Yes, Yitzchak Nieto became the Chacham afterwards. There were a lot of controversies. What a surprise. But Chacham David Nieto was highly respected throughout his life. Clearly, the ideas that he propounded were supported and sufficient for his congregation. And he, in many ways, was the paramount, the zenith of English religious virtuosity, at least until the 21st century, maybe, I don't know, depending, always sort of looked to as a high point in the English rabbinate. I think that's what I would say about him. So his son did take over, but his son did not have the status that he had, and that didn't go so well. So that was Chacham Nieto.
Okay, and
I'll tell you what. Can I tell you one more piece from his writing that gives you a sense of why I said earlier that I don't know that his ideas might have really impressed people who were deeply involved in the sciences. So I've mentioned that he had the student that is Dr. Jacob de Castro Sarmento, who was much younger, born, I think, late in the 17th century, or maybe even the beginning of the 18th century, in Portugal, and came to London and became very close with Chacham Nieto. In fact, he gave a sermon in Chacham Nieto's place on at least one occasion, and he gave a funeral sermon for him, and so on. 30 years later, De Castro Sarmento left the Jewish community, said that he couldn't agree with its principles anymore, and converted to Anglicanism. So like a comet, which was a topic that was very hot at this time, he sort of moved into the sphere of Judaism under the influence of Chacham Nieto, and after Nieto's death, sort of flew right back out. One wonders how impressed he was with Nieto, because Sarmiento was a genuine Newtonian. In fact, he wrote a book about the tides, the operations of the tides based on Newtonian principles in Portuguese for export to Portugal. So he was a serious scientist and a Newtonian, which Nieto was not. I'm going to give you an example of an argument that Nieto makes in the Kuzari HaSheini that gives you a sense, if you're willing to stay with me for another couple of minutes, it gives you a sense about his fit into the Newtonian world, or into the world of early Enlightenment England. He brings up the famous Chazal, the Tanuro Shalachnai, the story of the oven, the snake-shaped oven, right? And then there's an argument, very, very sort of dry halachic argument about whether this oven is susceptible to impurity, to tuma, from Baba Metzia Nontes Amud Aleph. So he brings it up, and the argument is between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua. And Rabbi Elazar is arguing very vehemently for his position, and he starts saying, he says, you know what? If the halacha is like me, let the river run backwards. And sure enough, the river runs backwards. And the Chachamim refuse to accept his position. We don't take halachic advice from trees. And then or from rivers, right? Then the trees, right? The trees move, right? The walls of the Beit Midrash start to fall in, and he says, right? If the halacha is like me, let the walls of the Beis Medrash fall in. They start to fall in, and so on and on like this. And they say, we don't accept that. And finally, he says, if the halacha is like me, let there be a bas kol. Let God tell you. And a bas kol, this heavenly voice comes down and says, halacha, Rabbi Eliezer, right? It is like him. And they famously respond, lo b'shamayim hi, right? The quotation from the Torah, it's not in heaven. And they understand that in the sense that, a bas kol, a voice from heaven, trees moving, rivers moving, right? We don't accept that. The Torah has been given to people to decide, and it is up to us to make the decisions. So he brings up that famous Agadata, and he says the Chachamim were absolutely right. Right? He's explaining the wisdom of the Chachamim. The Chachamim were right to reject Rabbi Eliezer and the bas kol and so on. On what basis, though, right? He gives an argument for this that no rabbi in history ever gave before, and probably not since. He says, when Alexander the Great wanted to talk to his troops, he used a certain device, a horn, right, or a trumpet, a voice trumpet, that allowed him to be heard for miles around. And this is a well-known phenomenon. He says, other people, right, invented these and expanded on this technology also. And he tells a story about a lord who sees his shepherd with his sheep off a mile away, and he uses one of these voice horns, right, and warns the shepherd that there's a bear coming to eat one of the sheep, and the poor shepherd has no idea where this voice is coming from, and he gets all freaked out and so on. He tells other stories like this also about people using this voice extending technologies of the day. And this was indeed a technology that people were extremely interested in right at his time. And Samuel Moreland and various figures of the period had invented or had expanded on this technique. And he says, you see, that is why the Chachamim refused to accept the bas kol, because it could have been a fake voice like this. They knew perfectly well when they heard this voice from heaven, the halachas like Rabbi Eliezer, who knows if there wasn't somebody pulling their leg with one of these horns, something like that. Well, the stories are very cute and the point is very interesting. But it seems obvious that the next question to ask is, if you're living among skeptics and deists and conversos, right, that you really have to take them by the horns. You have to take the questions that they're going to have by the horns. And the next question, of course, is, how do you know that Moshe Rabbeinu, that Moses wasn't fooled by such a fake voice? How do you know that Yirmiyahu, Yeshayahu, or Amos, or Tzfanya wasn't hearing a voice produced by a machine like that? In other words, you've made the argument based on this Chazal, on this Gemara, but why wouldn't the same argument go for anywhere that prophecy occurs in the Tanakh? But he doesn't go there. He just leaves it alone. It seems to me that this is emblematic of the way that Chacham Nieto deals with problems. He presents the problem, he brings it up, he faces down the issue of Spinozism or of divine providence or of acoustic manipulation or whatever it is, but his responses don't punch through to the real depths. There are other places where he brings up really problematic issues about providence and about the interference of God in the world, and whether God creates evil, about fate and choice and so on. It brings up some very tough questions, and he answers them in just ways that do not really take on the depth of the question. And this, I think, is why, although he was a great figure and a fascinating figure, he didn't create something in Judaism akin to the physico-theology in Christianity, which surely is what he wanted to do, because he's really trying to do, as Ruderman has shown, really trying to do some of the same things that the Newtonians were doing, trying to bring together science and religion and show how they support each other. But he just the sophistication of the arguments, not so much the questions he asks as the answers he gives, really don't make the grade in early 18th century London in a way that could have made a permanent sort of approach within Orthodox Judaism.
Wow. Okay. So, I mean, what would you recommend that people want to read more about this? I know you've written on Chacham Nieto, or is that available on your academia page?
Yeah. You can find. I believe you can find all my stuff on the academia page. Most of it says the stuff that I've said here, but there are a few other things. And then Jacob J. Petukovsky's book is probably available here and there. That is a terrific work. Although I differ with him on certain points, it's held up amazingly well since the 1950s. And then lots and lots of information in the book by Israel Solomons from the 1930s. It was originally a big article in the Journal of the English Jewish Historical Society, and then published as an independent volume, I think. So those are kind of the standard things. David Ruderman's article, probably available on his academia page, I imagine, is also a chapter in his book on Jews and science in the current period. Right. And there are other articles by various people.
Okay, I'll try to link to that, like I said. And then there's these two new translations into English, as well as the Mateh Dan from Mosada of Kook is available as well. You can look at the Tshuva and Tshuva Yuches Chacham Tzvi, but like I say, Ish Das is not around. But so I'll try to link to all of that, and people can check out more about Chacham Nieto. So and I almost forgotten. Like I said, there's that small little biography in Hebrew from Cecil Roth. I think they translated from English somewhere of his. That's in Hebrew in the Mosada of Kook. I don't know where the English is, but that's I think that's a translation people can.
I think it was. I think it was in one of his volumes. That Roth had a few of these volumes, Anglo-Jewish portraits or something like that, and I don't know. It's in one of his collected volumes in English.
Right. Okay. And then there's like I said, the Rabbi David Katz just did a podcast. So people familiar with his podcast and history, he just talked about Chacham Nieto as well. So all right, with that, thank you, Professor Goldish, for joining me once again.
Thank you for putting up with my long-winded responses.
Thank you.